Shalom Avram, James Trim here. I recently heard from somebody who, and I've heard this many times before, who made the claim, his exact statement was, the rabbis claim the oral law is superior to the Torah scribed by Moshe. This is simply false. It's just not true. First of all, I know what he's referring to. It's not the rabbis, first of all. It's a specific rabbi, a specific sage, rabbah. And what it's actually saying, the text in question, is in the Babylonian Talmud, Eruvin 21b. The individual in question has probably never even been in the same room with the Talmud. So he's simply repeating something that somebody else told him. But this passage is taken out of context very frequently. In fact, any Orthodox rabbi will tell you that the Written Torah is superior to the Oral Torah in the sense that if both are correctly preserved, they're both equal because they're both Torah. But the Written Torah may be more reliable than the Oral Torah, and any Oral Torah that contradicts a Written Torah is not valid. Okay? Now, where does this claim come from? Well, it comes from a passage cited out of context. It appears on the cover of this book, for example. This is the Galatians, a Torah-based commentary in first century Hebraic context, which is unfortunately an apology for Karaiteism. It was written by my friend Avi Ben Mordecai, and but unfortunately I can't say a lot of good things about the book because it takes Karaite Judaism anachronistically. There were no such thing as Karaites in the first century. There was no Karaite Judaism in the Second Temple era in the first century. Karaitism arose in the Middle Ages. Now, the passage in question is on the cover of this book. It's Eruvin 21, and you might be able to see it here on the cover of the book. And on the cover of the book, it's quoted, "My son, be careful concerning rabbinical decrees even more than the Torah, ... The Torah contains prohibitions, ... But anyone who violates a rabbinical decree is worthy of death." Babylonian Talmud, Eruvin 21b. So let's see what this is actually saying. Reading from the Sonsino translation, it says, and also here in context, Rabbah made the following exposition. What is the purpose of the scriptural text? And furthermore, my son, be admonished of making many books, etc. My son, be careful in the observance of the words of the scribes. My son, be more careful in the observance of the words of the scribes than in the words of the Torah, for in the laws of the Torah there are positive and negative precepts. But as to the laws of the scribes, whoever transgresses any of the enactments of the scribes incurs the penalty of death. In case you should object, if they are of real value, why were they not recorded in the Torah? The scripture states, of making many books there is no end. Now, this doesn't refer to the Oral Torah in general, first of all, because there are two types of Oral Torah, which I've explained in previous videos. One type of Oral Torah is Oral Torah from Sinai. That type of Oral Torah is not what this is talking about. That type of oral Torah, the other type of oral Torah are decrees of the courts, the decrees of the elders, the decrees of the judges. Okay, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. We've talked about it before. In fact, we talked about it in a recent video. But what this is saying then is that Rabbah, one of the great sages of the Talmud, made the following exposition. What is, let me read it here from the Jacob Neusner edition of the Talmud. It says, expounded Rabbah, what is the meaning of the verse of Scripture? And furthermore, my son, be admonished of many books, there is no end. That's Ecclesiastes 12:12. My son, be more careful about observing the words of the scribes than the words of the Torah. For the words of the Torah contain both positive and negative commandments, but as to words of the sages, whosoever transgresses the words of the sages is subject to the death penalty. And should you say, well, if there is anything of substance in them, then how come they're not written down? Scripture said, of making many books, there is no end. In other words, if you just keep writing and writing and writing, there will be no end to it. So originally and anciently, it was not permitted to write down the Oral Torah. It was eventually done out of fear that the Oral Torah would be lost, particularly under the oppressions such as under Trajan, that there was fear that with the study of Torah being prohibited by Rome, that the oral information might not get passed from generation to generation, and it needed to be written down for future generations. So now let's dissect this and see what it's saying. What it says is, my son, be more careful in observance of the words of the scribes than of the words of the Torah. For in the laws of the Torah, there are positive and negative precepts. So what it's really saying here, what's understood to mean, is that in the written Torah, we have different types of commandments. We have negative commandments, thou shalt nots, prohibitions, positive commandments, thou shalt commandments, you shall do this. We have you shall not do that. And each of these different commandments, 613 of them, have various penalties. Some of them are capital. They incur the death penalty. Some of them only incur a fine. Some of them, the penalty is only being unclean until evening. So there's a variety of possible penalties. Servitude is also a potential penalty. So it's not always the death penalty. If you eat pork, for example, then the penalty is being unclean until evening. A thief, his penalty is to pay back a double portion of, so he not only has to repay what he stole, but he has to also pay back a second portion of equal value to what he stole, so that he learns and he knows what it's like to have that amount taken from him. Okay, there are different penalties for different transgressions of Torah, of written Torah. Okay, so this is what it's saying. So the written Torah, there's different written Torah. There are different commandments. Some of them are positive commandments, and some of them are negative commandments. They have a variety of penalties. But as to the laws of the scribes, whoever transgresses any of the enactments of the scribes incurs the penalty of death. Okay, so this is actually referring to something that is in the written Torah. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 8 through 12, the Torah says, if there arise a matter too hard for you in judgment, between blood and blood, between plea and plea, and between stroke and stroke, even matters of controversy within your gates. Then shall you arise and get you up into the place which Yahweh your Elohim shall choose. And you shall come unto the Kohanim, the Levites, and unto the judge that shall be in those days, and you shall inquire, and they shall declare unto you the sentence of judgment. And you shall do according to the tenor of the sentence which they shall declare unto you from that place which Yahweh shall choose, and you shall observe to do according to all that they shall teach you. So in other words, if there arises an issue that isn't addressed in Torah, a controversy of where the Torah, the written Torah, hasn't given you a clear determination, a clear ruling or commandment. Let me give you an example. The Torah says that under certain circumstances, if a thief steals something and the thief is apprehended, he has to pay a double portion. Now, the Torah also talks about guardians of property, situations where a guardian is in possession of property that he's responsible for, that he has some level of liability for, because he's implicitly, because he's in possession of the item. He's a guardian, a shomer of the item. Okay, so maybe he's borrowed it, maybe he's rented it, maybe it's been put up as a pledge for a loan, maybe he was just asked to watch after it as a favor. But for whatever reason, he's a guardian of this property. So what happens then if the property is stolen from him as a guardian and the thief is found? Who gets the double portion? The additional punitive damages. Does that go to the victim of the theft, who was only the guardian of the property but not the owner of the property, or the owner of the property? Okay, and then we can throw in a little twist to it. Let's say the guardian says to the owner of the property, before the thief is found, there's no telling if the thief will be found. I want to make you whole. I'm going to pay you back. I'm going to pay you the value of the property because I want you to be made whole. And so the guardian of the property compensates the owner of the property for the value of the property, and then the thief is found. Who gets the double portion? These things aren't covered in the written Torah, okay? But they come up in real life when you're trying to live out Torah, okay? When you actually have a community that is operating according to Torah, this situation comes up, and it goes to the Torah court that we are required in Torah to have. In Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 18, we're required to set these courts up. And so verses 8 through 10 say, if this kind of a controversy comes up, you bring it to the judges that shall be in those days. You bring it to the sages, if you will. Okay? You bring it to the judges. And verse 11 then says, according to the Torah which they shall teach you. So in other words, verse 11 says that this sentence which they hand down is also Torah. That's what the Torah says. That's a component of the Oral Torah. It becomes part of the Oral Torah. Okay? So according to the Torah that they shall teach you, and according to the judgment which they shall tell you, you shall do. It's important that it becomes part of the Torah because when the same situation comes up again, we want a consistent law. We want to know, and people need to know what to expect and what their actual criminal and civil liabilities are, etc. Okay? So just like we have court precedents in the United States where once a court rules on a matter, it becomes precedence and is binding upon lower courts and so on. Okay. So according to the Torah which they shall teach you, and according to the judgment which they shall tell you, you shall do. You shall not turn aside from the sentence they shall declare unto you, to the right hand nor to the left. And then we get to verse 12. And verse 12 says, and the man that does presumptuously in not hearkening unto the Kohen that stands to minister before Yahweh your Elohim, or unto the judge, even that man shall die, and you shall exterminate the evil from Israel. Deuteronomy 17, verses 8 through 12. Don't trust me. Don't believe me. Go look them up. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 8 through 12. So this creates something interesting. Okay? According to the written Torah, there are a number of variety of commandments in the written Torah for which sometimes the penalty is death, but sometimes there's a lesser penalty, sometimes a much lesser penalty. Servitude for a period of time, or a fine, a financial penalty, or just simply being unclean for a period of time. Okay? But for this Torah, what is called Torah in verse 11, this oral Torah, that according to verse 11 is Torah, verse 12 tells us the penalty for violating it is death in every instance. It's always death. Now, this is what the written Torah says. This is the word of Elohim. Okay? All this passage in Tractate Eruvin is saying is repeating what's in the written Torah. The written Torah is the text that's telling us that the penalty for violating the oral Torah aspect of oral Torah, that is the rulings or the decrees of the sages, the rulings of these Torah courts, the penalty for that is death in every case, whereas the penalty for written Torah is sometimes death. So, going back to our passage in the Babylonian Talmud in Eruvin 21b, Rabbah made the following exposition. So Rabbah is giving an exposition on a passage in Ecclesiastes that says, what is the purpose of the scriptural text? And furthermore, my son, be admonished of making many books, etc. Saying, why does this passage say not to write everything down? And what does it apply to? And he says, Rabbah says, it means my son. He's repeating my son from Ecclesiastes. He says, my son, be more careful in the observance of the words of the scribes than in the words of the Torah, the written Torah. For in the words of the Torah, there are positive and negative precepts, some of which have death as a penalty, but some of which have only being unclean for a limited period of time as a penalty, or paying a fine as a penalty. But as to the laws of the scribes, as to the decrees of the sages of the Torah courts, as described in the Torah, by the way, which the Torah itself calls Torah, whoever transgresses any of the enactments of the scribes incurs the penalty of death, and that is Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 12. Okay? But as for the laws of the scribes, whoever transgresses any of the enactments of the scribes incurs the penalty of death. In case you should object and say, so what if one should say, and should respond to this and say, if these decrees in Deuteronomy chapter 17 are so significant that Deuteronomy 17 says that they incur the death penalty in every instance, even though the written Torah has commandments and decrees for which the penalty is substantially less than death. Anything less than death is substantially less than death. Then why how is it that these decrees are so important? After all, they're not even written down, and Rabbah is telling us this is why we read in Ecclesiastes that if making many books there is no end. In other words, we can't write everything down. So, interestingly, when opponents of the Oral Torah criticize, first of all, misquote and paraphrase Tractate Eruvin 21b out of context, what they don't realize that Eruvin 21b is actually only restating what is in the Written Torah. And that their criticism isn't a criticism of the Oral Torah, their criticism is a criticism of the Written Torah in Deuteronomy chapter 17. All right, I just need to remind everybody to please donate to support this work. You can do that by clicking on the donate link in the video description. We are facing a financial shortfall, and we need to raise at least $330 by the end of the day today. So if you can possibly donate, please help us out. For those that don't know, my wife's chronically ill. She suffers chronic pain. She's disabled, and I am her at-home caretaker, in addition to this work that I do on Hebrew and Aramaic New Testament origins and Jewish origins of the background of the so-called New Testament. All right. Also, please like our video, subscribe to our channel, click that notification bell. Let us know what you think in the comments, and participate in the discussions in the in the discussion area. You can donate by clicking the donate link in the video description, or sending donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org. That's donations@wnae.org. Until next time, everybody, shalom.